We have this wonderful scene in the book of Genesis of Abraham all of a sudden being visited by three who come as guests into his tent. And it is in many ways a reminder of what he was promised by the Lord. And it is a promise that he believes in, that he puts his faith in. It's also interesting that he's located in the terebinth of Mamre, as we hear in that opening line of that reading from Genesis. The terebinth are trees that are very old. They last for over a millennium, over 1,000 years. And even when they're cut down, they have a resilience about them to grow back. And that is the kind of resilience that is given to the faith of Abraham as he puts his faith in the promise of God. And so let's look a little more closely at what is it that Abraham experiences in having the faith in the promise of God. For God doesn't do anything for him yet. He has to put his faith in the promise that God will fulfill what he has given to him. The first thing we see is that Abraham is not alone. He understands that in the world that so often can leave us alone, he is always in the presence of the Lord. These three visitors who come to him remind him that the Lord continues to visit him, to be with him. We all know what it's like to feel loneliness in our lives. It's a very painful experience because we begin to convince ourselves that we're all very vulnerable, we're on our own, we're left to our own wiles. And yet, when we have faith in the promise of God, we experience the fact that the Lord is always with us, that he's present. The second thing that we notice is that Abraham, even before the promise is fulfilled, has a certain amount of joy in his life. He gets up very quickly and offers them something to eat. Even before the meal starts, he's enjoying it. His hungers for God's presence are being fulfilled. Mary also in the gospel has that understanding and that feeling, that experience in life. She sits before the Lord and knows that because she's in the presence of Jesus, she's being satisfied, even before the meal that Martha is preparing begins. That too is part of a faith that believes in the promise of God, that we begin already to enjoy anything that the Lord would promise us or fulfill in our lives. And that's so very important because we become easily distracted by going after all sorts of very cheap and maybe artificial things that satisfy us. Things that are the newest product in the world that we maybe would think everybody says we must have, or the latest movie that we must see. And in order to, in fact, satisfy our hungers for the hungers in our heart. In fact, Mary as well as Abraham, because of their faith in the promise that God gives them, are already satisfied. And finally, we notice that the three men, the guests, are going to leave. And yet they promise to come back. And when they come back, there will be a son. Isaac will be born. It's a reminder that in those moments in which we feel the absence of God, and maybe in which our prayers become dry, it's just an opportunity for the Lord to prepare something even greater in our lives. So often in our lives we have hungers for God, and we maybe think that God has forgotten us or abandoned us. But that emptiness is just an opening for God to bring out more in our lives. I always like the stories of St. Ignatius of Loyola, who was wounded in a war, and he began to read all sorts of novels and stories about great heroes of chivalry. They didn't satisfy him. But when he began to read about the lives of the saints and what Jesus did in the Gospels, he began to have a sense of fulfillment that the Lord kept coming back to him time and time again. So today it's an opportunity, maybe if we live in that in-between, between the fact that God's promise is not fulfilled, if we put our faith in God's promise, it'll be experienced as not being left alone, but also of having the enjoyment right now of what God will have in store for us. And we also will believe that the Lord will continue to come back in our lives in a much, much richer way. I think it's important for us to have that kind of faith that we bring to the Eucharist, for there is a sense of promise that the Eucharist receives just a foretaste of what God will give us in the final banquet. Putting our trust in the promise of God will give us a sense of not being left alone, will help us experience a joy in this time that can satisfy us, and also will receive the experience in life that whenever there's emptiness in our lives, whenever there's a vacuum of God's presence, he will come back in a way that will call us even to greater things and his greater presence in our lives.